Mônica, podemos começar.
Então, bom dia a todos. Good morning to all of you. It's our great pleasure today to have, fortunately and often, a visitor to our institute, Pinar Bilgin. But since maybe not all of you have already had the opportunity to have contact with her, I'll give you her short bio. Pinar Bilgin is a professor of international relations at Bilkent University in Turkey. She holds a PhD in international politics from the University of Wales. She's the author of Regional Security in the Middle East, a Critical Perspective, the International in Security, Security in the International, and co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of International Political Sociology. She also published Asia in International Relations, Unthinking Imperial Power Relations. So she's certainly the perfect person to talk to us today. This is an invitation made by our Global South Unit for Mediation and the BRICS Policy Center. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Pinar will talk to us for a while, and then we will listen to your comments and questions. Pinar, the floor is yours. Welcome to EDI. I'm sorry you're not here physically, but I'm happy you're here anyway.
Thank you. Thank you for this generous introduction, and thank you to all of you, Paula in particular, for the invitation as well. Yes, as Monica said, I've been at your institution several times. I enjoy very much going back. Hopefully, there will be another time that we'll meet in Rio as opposed to virtually. But let's make the best of this opportunity as well. So thank you all of you, Monica, Paula, and everyone else who's involved. And thank you all of you for registering, for showing up on a Friday morning for you and Friday afternoon for those of us who are currently located in Turkey and anyone else in between in time zones. I'm going to share every now and then my screen with you and some slides, but it's not a slide heavy presentation. Okay, so every now and then I'm going to turn on my slides and then turn it off as well. Let's begin by talking about my title here. This is my title. What does it mean to think post-colonially about security? So why am I asking this question? Why am I venturing into thinking post-colonially about security? Do we not already have multiple approaches that allow us to think critically about security? You may be introduced already to some of them, or you may be being introduced to them throughout this semester. So do we not have enough critical approaches? Why another one? And this is a new perspective that is particularly difficult to appreciate, to get into, especially in the beginning. So why indeed? Let's begin with that. So I'll begin by suggesting that we face important challenges to world security to think about, right? You do not necessarily need me to tell you about, you don't really need me to tell you about the pandemic, but there's also climate change, issues surrounding sustainability. So there are critical issues that we're facing, and the suggestion that I'm beginning with is that we need to think deeper and further about these issues, deeper and further than some of our critical approaches to security or international relations would allow. Okay, so my suggestion to begin with, and I'm trying to provide you a little bit of theoretical as well as empirical evidence here, is that thinking post-colonially allows us to think a little bit deeper and a little bit further than some of the other critical approaches that we're familiar with. And the example that I'm going to talk about is human mobility of people. you'd be experiencing the mobility of people, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, depending on the context in your part of the world. In my part of the world, the biggest crisis in the early 2010s was the people who were fleeing the civil war in Syria. Nowadays, people fleeing the new regime in Afghanistan, the Taliban regime. So this is what is referred to as the crisis in the Mediterranean. Let's look at a cartoon from the time when this crisis was taking place, right? This was portrayed, this cartoon portrays what was happening as an EU crisis, right? But Turkey was a part of this as well. I'm going to look at this issue as a crisis as viewed by the European Union. So this is my empirical example that I'm going to discuss with you. You may not be interested in the Mediterranean, you may not have actually heard about this crisis, but I think there are issues that we can actually learn from and the lessons that we can draw from this example, even if you're not actually interested in this part of the world. So human mobility affects us in one way or another, right? Managing human mobility is a concern in different ways. And we know that when national security concerns take over in the management of human mobility, a number of insecurities follow from that, right? When national security is prioritized vis-a-vis human security, a number of insecurities for human beings and societies follow from that. You may be familiar with securitization, desecuritization debates. If you're interested, I can get into that in the discussion, but I'm not going to do that right now. But please feel free to ask about this in the discussion. Some people actually approach this issue of human mobility purely from a humanitarian perspective. So they would not necessarily think of what was happening in 2015 as a humanitarian, as a crisis, but a humanitarian emergency. So that's a different perspective. And depending whether you call it a crisis, right, whether you call it a refugee crisis or a migrant crisis, gives away a little bit of your politics, right? Are these people migrants who are choosing to come, right? Or are they refugees fleeing the context? Okay. But what goes unchanged in both kinds of characterizations, what was happening is that the issue was presented as a crisis, right? A crisis that needs to be addressed. And crises require different kinds of policies. And I'm going to talk about that, right? The politics of crises, the politics of labeling an issue, a problem, a crisis, construction of crisis, if you want to call it. I'm going to follow Jutta Weldes in a moment's time. Okay, now, from daily politics that if you present an issue as a problem, it elicits some kind of response. If you present it as an emergency, it elicits a different kind of response. If you call it a humanitarian emergency, it elicits a different kind of response. So these kinds of framings of events are important in terms of policy world, right? It's important for us as citizens as well. We sit up and listen if something is called a security crisis. But there is a scholarly dimension to all this, and there is a politics that scholars can study here, and that's the politics that I'm going to talk about. I'm talking here about politics, not in everyday politics. Let me share another slide with you here. And this time, this is Ken Booth's notion of analogy of security as a volcano, right? This is from his book Theory of World Security. And in that book, he talks about uniting security with political theory. This is not in terms of injecting politics into security, but actually bringing out the already embedded politics in security. Yeah, security is already political through and through. We need to be able to figure out how it is political. In this analogy, he says that in the volcano, the bits that we see when it erupts, right, that's visible. You can't really escape the eruption. This is the policy output, he says. That is, that is visible to everyone, as with the volcano's eruption. Everyone knows that aspect of politics, the policy outputs, declaring an emergency, for instance. even people, who have no interest in politics know about this dimension of politics. This is not what he's talking about in terms of studying the politics of security. This bit here, the political fracture zone, is what takes place in a visible part of the volcano, right? So you can actually, you don't want to go in, but you can actually send robots in to study what is going on inside the volcano. So this is a part of politics that can relatively easily be studied. You can go and do interviews. You can figure out, if you're doing archival work, you can look at what discussions were taking place behind closed doors. So this is a kind of politics that we study. And this is the kind of course, politics that opposition is engaged in as well. They may not necessarily be forming policy, but they are critical of policy. They are challenging those who are making policy. This is also not the bit that he's interested in when he says politics, security is political and we should be studying the politics of this. He's interested in the deep structure of politics. So that bit of the volcano that is actually beneath the surface, right? Deep structure of politics beneath the surface. So we know how to study that as well, but it's not as easy as looking at the policy output, right? The eruption, the lava. It's not as easy as studying the fracture zone, what's happening here, but it's the depth of the volcano. That's the political bit that he's interested in. And that's also the bit that I'm actually going to talk about today. Okay. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that critical approaches take us quite far in terms of thinking about contemporary security challenges, right? In terms of going, beneath the visible surface. But postcolonial thinking postcolonial involves asking further questions, right? It allows us to think even more deeply about the issues that we're interested in. So, as I said, I'm going to focus on the issue of human mobility as my illustration. Let me then, as my next task, define what I understand by thinking postcolonially for you, right? I've laid out what I'm going to do today. I've already suggested to you what my argument is going to be, going a little bit further than critical approaches, right? But what does thinking postcolonially entail? Now, you and I are located in countries that do not really identify with postcolonial statehood, right? So thinking postcolonially may sometimes come across as not relevant, depending on the context, right? But thinking postcolonially is not about having experienced colonialism, okay? It's not about having experienced colonialism. It's not about identifying with postcolonial statehood or not. That's not the issue here. So it's not only about the experiences of those who have direct experience or memories of that experience. The thinking postcolonially, as I understand it, it involves taking into consideration the imprint that colonialism has left, right? The imprint that colonialism has left on both the colonizers, the colonized, right, and everyone else. So it includes all of us, right? The colonizers, the colonized, and everyone else in different ways, of course, depending on how much power they have in world politics or had in world politics, of course, in different ways, right? But it leaves an imprint on all of us. And thinking postcolonially, as I understand it, is about taking that imprint into consideration when we do international relations, okay? Thinking postcolonially is about taking that input into consideration when thinking about world politics. And this, I'm going to identify 3 dimensions of this for you, 3 dimensions of the imprint that colonialism has left on all of us, right? One of them is material exploitation. The second one is define and rule. Let me show them to you. Second one is define and rule. And the third one is a claim to know. Material exploitation, define and rule, and claim to know. And I'm going to go through them one by one, very quickly, well, relatively quickly, and tell you what I mean by them. The material the exploitation dimension is relatively easy to talk about, actually. This is, even those who do not necessarily want to think postcolonially admit that there is a material dimension that needs to be addressed. The quote that I am going to read out to you is from Frantz Fanon. He said in his book, Europe is literally the creation of the third world. Europe, he said, literally is the creation of the third world. In his books overall, yeah, he talks about all of these dimensions. He does not really limit himself to the material dimension only, but here he's talking about how the shipments of diamond, oil, silk, cotton, timber, and exotic produce helped Europe become what it is, right? Europe, he says, is literally the creation of the third world. Of course, you would know from your history classes the whole experience with South America as well. Others may be familiar with the Indian experience or African experience. So looking at different parts of the world, you know how these shipments have created in enrichment in Europe. So on the one hand, the material dimension is relatively straightforward. Everyone admits to that, although they may not necessarily agree on what to do about it. But it's also a difficult one in the sense that those who admit to the importance of this imprint may think that this is something that belongs to the past, right? Okay, it happened centuries ago. Now we live in a different world, so this is not really relevant for our understanding of international relations at the moment. So this is, again, as I said, it is more easy to understand, but it's also difficult to get people to understand its continuing relevance. That exploitation is not something that only belongs in the past. This is not something that belongs to history, and it's not just about past relations of material exploitation, but it continues even today. If you're interested in this dimension, right, and how it links up with security, I'm going to recommend to you an article by Isaac Kamola, right, published in Third World Quarterly, where he links coffee production, right? Have you had your morning coffee yet, right? He links coffee production to the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s, okay? He looks at the structural dimension of making the Rwandan genocide possible. He's not making a causal argument. He does not say, you know, your coffee consumption is causing this. He looks at the structural dimension, making the genocide possible. If you're interested in, okay, Third World Quarterly article is very, very interesting read. So this is what we're talking about, not just past relations of material exploitation, but present relations as well, and how this links up with insecurities. Okay, we're coming to the second one. Define and rule, right? Don't let's not make a mistake. It's not divide and rule, right? It's not divide and rule. It's define and rule. And the text that I'm referring to here is by Mahmoud Mamdani. He has a book with the same title, Define and Rule. He's looking at a number of examples from Africa, including Rwanda, if you want to carry with that theme, right? And what the point about this is that divide and rule we're already familiar with, right? Most of the colonizing act is understood in terms of divide and rule, but this is something that we know from our everyday lives as well. Class relations, the management of the employers, how they manage the labor is in terms of divide and rule strategy. So you would know this from following daily politics as well. Class relations are notoriously associated with divide and rule strategies. Define and rule is something else, right? Define and rule is about not just breaking up a body of people who are already different, have different understandings of their interests, right? But telling them who they are and what their interests are. Define and rule. So Mamdani's argument with reference to a number of cases from Africa is that the colonizers did not just divide and rule, they first defined who people were, defined their differing characteristics, and based on those definitions, they then divided and ruled. Okay, so this is a very interesting argument, and it has all kinds of implications for our understanding of contemporary conflicts as well. GSUM is our sponsor, so this is something, if you're interested in the kind of work that GSUM does, this is an argument that has immense implications in terms of our understanding of conflicts in different parts of the world. He says, Mamdani in that book says, the native, he says, classified and reclassified, or some people were classified as natives, others not, right? That also involves a definition. And each time he says these classifications and reclassifications were taking place, it was in reference to a political necessity, right? A political necessity on the part of the colonizers and their interests in ruling as well, of course, right? So thinking post-colonially in terms of in terms of this dimension allows us to analyze how the colonizers were able to define and redefine people, right? And they've done this, admittedly, so skillfully that so many centuries later, we're still living with with their definitions, and we still understand contemporary conflicts in terms of those definitions, and we still, find conflicts intractable, difficult to address because of our understanding of those definitions. This brings me to the third dimension. Okay, my third dimension is about the claim to know. And these are all interrelated, by the way. I started with material dimension, relatively easy to understand. We moved on to define and rule, a little bit more difficult. And the third one is the claim to know. This is a little bit more tricky. This is the most difficult to perhaps grasp, but it's also most productive. We're all students of world politics. This is the most productive for us. And this is the one that actually allows us to go a little bit further than critical approaches to international relations allow us to do, although critical IR is also interested in this question. So this claim to know is about the production of knowledge, right? And how some are able to define others, some are able to produce knowledge about others, right? And tell them what they deserve in terms of a good life in world politics, right? Define others, produce knowledge about others. Have you heard of Orientalism, right? Producing knowledge about the whole body of people. And then, of course, tell everyone involved what kind of policy they deserve, what kind of a good life they can achieve in this world, and what they can't achieve in this world. The discussions around modernization theory, for instance, you may be familiar with development of underdevelopment. You're definitely going to be familiar with that one. These are all cases that you can actually study as part of this claim to know kinds of discussions. This is also a colonial imprint, right? This is this claim to knowledge. Some have ability to claim knowledge, to produce knowledge about others. This is another dimension. This is the most difficult dimension, as I said. And you have several experts already in your own institution who are going to be talking about or have already told you about these dimensions. That's why I'm not going into the details of any of these. But as I said, I'm happy to come back to them if you have questions. The third one is difficult, but also most valuable, most productive, I said, because it allows the other two to take place, right? It allows material exploitation to continue. It allows us to keep with those definitions that were created as part of the colonial setup, so long as this claim to know it does not go, it goes unchallenged. That's the most critical one for all of us. But then challenging that is not necessarily easy to do. If you're postgraduate students and following discussions, these are things that we're actually discussing in international relations nowadays. These are not difficult. These are not easy to study because the textbooks that you read don't necessarily tell us about these things, right? They have a particular narrative about the Rwandan genocide, for instance. You do not get to read the Mondani version or the Isaac Kamola version that I was telling you about. You need to do a little bit of detective work, right? If you're into that kind of thing, right? You need to go a little bit deeper. You need to ask different questions, and you need to ask different questions to different people who do not always get consulted about these issues, different sources. There is a bit of archival discussion here, if you want me to go into that afterwards. There's a little bit of methodological discussion. Again, I can get into that, and some epistemological discussion as well. I'm going to, sidestep all of those in the interest of time. But again, I'm happy to come back to all of those. But I'm going to go into my discussion with reference to the case that I'm talking about, so that we can see actually these three dimensions of the colonial imprint, with special emphasis on the third one, this claim to know. Define and rule I'm going to bypass, but claim to know I'm going to talk more about, and a way I'm going to suggest to you a way of getting out of this. Now let's look at some figures here. Okay, I'm sharing UNHCR's webpage with you. Let's look at these figures at the moment, what I'm pointing to here, right? So in 2014, this was the arrival figure, around 200,000. And you look at the figure in 2015, right? Quite an increase, fourfold, right? A little bit more. And then it gradually comes down to slightly above 2014 figures, and then goes even further down. So this is when the crisis happens. 2015 continues a little bit into 2016. And here you can see the flows, right? Some go through Turkey to Cyprus and Greece. Some are coming directly from North Africa. There is a connection between Morocco and Spain here. Some are coming directly from Africa, from Egypt, from Libya, from Tunisia, into mostly Greece and Italy. This used to be the pattern in which people moved in the Mediterranean, through Turkey to Greece, arriving mostly in Italy and in Spain. This used to be the case. What happened in 2015 was that people also started to arrive on foot, sometimes crossing the land border between Turkey and Greece. And what they did was to actually get on trains, travel by train onwards. So they were no longer arriving in Italy or in Spain or in Greece only, the Mediterranean members of the European Union. They were arriving in Germany, in Denmark, in Sweden, right? Getting off the train in those countries. So this was a part of the problem at the time, right? So Greece and Italy and Spain were already used to dealing with this kind of crisis, the mobility of people. But Germany was not used to this kind of arrivals. Hungary was not used to this, or Denmark was not used to this. So part of the problem was the hike in figures, fourfold increase, right? That's already a problem onto itself, but also arrival points. They're arriving in places where policymakers are not used to dealing with this kind of human mobility. And it was as part of this context that the issue got labeled as a migrant crisis. If you go to Germany, refugee crisis, not a migrant crisis, in 2015, right? So here I'm going to analyze the making of this crisis, okay? And I'm going to analyze the making of this crisis by drawing on critical approaches to security. I'm going to draw on Jutta Weldes, her book on cultural production of crises, right? Cultural production of crises. That's a constructivist text. Some of you are already nodding, so you're familiar with this. So I'm going to draw on her work to look at how was this crisis constructed. There was nothing inevitable about the construction of this crisis. Okay, but I'm going to take one more step, remember, okay? I'm going to tell you what the postcolonial perspective adds to this. But let's do our job step by step. So the cultural construction of crisis, let's look at this. Now, in dictionaries, the definition of crisis is something as a turning point, as an unexpected event, or a decisive stage in the progress of something. When you look at the events of 2015, it fits none of them, right? There was nothing unexpected about the arrival of people fleeing the Syrian war, right? It was not a turning point. It was not a decisive stage in the progress of something. The figures were very high, right? And the arrival points had changed. But other than that, there was nothing inevitable about the declaration of a crisis. Italy, Greece, and Spain were already very experienced in dealing with migrants, so it was business as usual for them. It was for those who are not really used to these kinds of figures that was partly a problem. And they were experienced and they had carried the burden, by the way. Okay, so what happens in 2015, how is it possible for this issue to be turned into a crisis is something that we need to understand. Now, I'll say two things about this, how it is possible to turn this issue into a crisis. First is that there is nothing inevitable about this. There is nothing inevitable in terms of European responses, right? If you look at the papers, things may come across to you as inevitable, right? But go beyond everyday discussions. Look at this issue historically. That's what the critical IR tells us to do, yeah? Historicize and contextualize everything, right? Look at the root causes of events. And if you look at this in terms of historical context, you see that contrary to these everyday discussions, presenting the European self as in need of a defense against this Mediterranean other, that narrative is not old, okay? It's not an old narrative. It's not an age-old narrative, right? This is not an ancient hatred, if you wish. If you look at EU narratives on the Mediterranean, you do not really find this if you look at them in the 1950s. You do not find this in the 1960s. In the 70s, it begins with the far right only, so it's a marginal discourse. From the 1980s onwards, it starts changing, and I'm going to say a little bit about that, okay? So there was nothing inevitable about presenting the European self as a need of a defense against the Mediterranean other. That needed to be constructed, okay? That narrative needed to be constructed. So the connected point here is that construction has different stages. It does not happen immediately. It takes a while, and there's a lot of effort. A lot of effort goes into making this construction of the mobility of people possible. Okay. Remember Booth's volcano. We're going deep now. Yeah. We're going beyond policy outputs. We're looking at the fracture zone, but we're historicizing the fracture zone, right? Now migrants start to arrive. For those of you who are not familiar with the European Union history, workers start to arrive in the EC upon invitation. Okay, they do not just show up by themselves. Some do, definitely, but there is a program, guest worker program at the time. And this is considered vital for the reconstruction of Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. At the time, a number of European countries are developing, industrializing, and they're in need of labor. So they invite laborers, but they're called guest workers. Guess what? They're guests. They're expected to be sent back home after the kind of purpose that served afterwards. So they start arriving in the 1960s, right? And at that time, they are, of course, welcomed. They were invited after all. The whole discourse is not one of insecurity at all. And many of these are coming from either the east of Europe or the south of Europe. So there's a whole Mediterranean workers discourse around that time, right? Mediterranean workers discourse. But the definition of Mediterranean, you may be interested in this, the definition of Mediterranean includes Italy, includes Greece, includes Spain and Portugal. Among these countries, only Italy is a member at the time. So if there is a negative connotation to Mediterranean workers, it's not EU versus Mediterranean kind of thing, right? It's Mediterranean versus non-Mediterranean. There is not an EU versus Mediterranean dichotomy here, which is very interesting. It's not self versus European self versus the Mediterranean other yet. It's only Italy that's part of the EC at the time. In the 1980s, of course, these other three countries join one after the other. That's Portugal, Spain, and Greece join one after the other. But even then, the Europe versus the Mediterranean discourse is not there yet. It's beginning among the far right, and as part of the economic downturn in European economies. And that downturn is, of course, linked up with the oil crisis in 1973. Okay, so there's a shortage of jobs, and the guest workers, some of whom did not turn out to be guests, right, stayed on, are blamed for this. But again, it is not constructed in terms of Europe versus the Mediterranean. It's guest workers and the kind of problems that they cause. It's only when we come to the 1990s, right? As recently as that, okay? It's only when we come to the 1990s that this discourse of Mediterranean workers as, you know, something that needs to be addressed as a problem starts to move from the far right into the more mainstream, okay? And as you can imagine, there's a lot of work that goes into moving such a far-right discourse into the mainstream. There is a whole socio-political context to all of this happening as well. 9/11 is a part of this, right? There's no denying that. 9/11 is a part of this, but it is not the main cause. European Union has its own domestic dynamics that help explain part of what is going on here as well. So the point that I am making now here is that there is nothing inevitable about characterizing the Mediterranean as an other to the European self. It becomes possible through the efforts of right-wing political actors and in the context of an economic downturn in Europe in the aftermath of the oil embargo, which impacts European Union, EC members' economies more than it does the United States. So it's in this context that the 2015 migrant crisis becomes possible. It's as part of this that the issue gets constructed as a need for, as a security need, the need for Europe to be defended against these migrants coming from the Mediterranean, culturally now constructed as so far away from the European South. There is a whole effort that goes into this, right? We've gone into the volcano, right? We've looked at how the far right actors have been important in terms of this production. But even in the 1990s, you had to make a lot of effort to make this argument. And 9/11, I'm afraid, facilitated in all of this, right? This is where the critical approaches to security take us. They allow us to study the cultural production of this crisis in 2015, cultural production of crisis. That this culture of European versus the Mediterranean, right? Europe versus the Mediterranean had to be constructed. So far, you're with me. Okay. Now, how about this understanding of culture, right? We now know about the production, but how do we study the production of culture? We can study cultural production of things, But how do we study this element of the production of culture, production of and reproduction of culture? Constructivism only gets us so far in terms of understanding this. How is it that we understand ourselves as the European self, right? And think of others as not only beyond Europe, right? But also before Europe. I'm making references to the literature here. I borrowed the term from Derek Gregory. He borrows it from someone else. If you're interested, I actually have written about this and I can give you the references afterwards. Okay, how is it that people who are coming from beyond Europe are portrayed as before Europe? They belong to the past. They're backward, right? And therefore, they should not be allowed here, either for economic reasons, right? They're coming here to make use of the opportunities that we have created here, social services, for instance, right? Or there is another side to this argument. I'm going to make things a little bit more colorful here. There's another side to this argument. They're culturally so different that if they come here, we won't be able to live as who we are, right? This is the final point now I'm making. If you're getting a little bit restless that I've spoken too much, this is my final point. So what happens then in 2015, when migrants start arriving, is some countries are more welcoming than others in accepting Syrian refugees, but there are a number of incidents. This reflects the one incident in Germany. We still don't have proper understanding of what happened there, right? This is a particularly striking representation of what happened in Germany. There are a number of incidents between migrant men or refugee men and German women in Germany. But it's not just about these incidents. There's a whole discourse that goes at the time with the arrival of these culturally different migrants who do not really respect women's rights, right? Women suddenly enter the picture. They don't always make an appearance in international relations, right? So these are migrants who are culturally very different. They do not respect human rights. If we let them in, because there's an important movement to let migrants in, German leaders were actually making an effort to increase the number of Syrian refugees in the European Union. If we let them in, right, what happens to women's security? What happens to women's security? This is a very valid concern. We want women's security to be considered, right? In international relations and security studies, we actually make a lot of effort for people to care about women's security, and suddenly women's security was making the headlines, right? So this came across as something desirable. Suddenly women's security was making the headlines. Even the more far-right papers were suddenly saying, you know, if we let them in, what happens to women's security? So those people who did not necessarily take violence against gender-based violence into consideration a couple of months ago were now worried about women's security as a result of migrants' arrival. Now, there is a little bit of hypocrisy involved here, as you have already noticed, but that's not the bit that I'm going to talk about here. Politics involves hypocrisy. That's not my task here. But what I'm going to try and interrogate here is that the portrayal of the people coming from the Mediterranean as before Europe, as belonging to the past, right? As belonging to a different culture, right? So we are post-feminist in Europe, right? We are beyond this. We've addressed all of our problems. Women have full equality. Gender-based violence is a concern. We're concerned about this. But if we let these people in who apparently don't have the same kind of respect for women's rights, what's going to happen to women? That's the kind of discourse. the bit that, critical approaches do not really take us far is the construction of this element of cultural difference. Okay, this element of cultural difference, cultures as this versus that. And here there is a claim to know what the culture of the arriving migrants or refugees are, right? There is a claim to know. And there is also a claim to know how they have arrived here. Okay, this is the bit that critical approaches do not really allow us to interrogate. That's why we need to take a little bit further step and deeper analysis into look at this issue from a postcolonial perspective, right? This discourse of backwardness, belonging to the past, beyond Europe being before Europe, all this discourse needs to be constructed as well, and postcolonial approaches allow us to study this. What we learn from these approaches is that what is presented to us as before Europe, right? Mean belonging to the past, before Europe, having come before Europe, is actually the aftermath. It's the aftermath of colonialism. It's the aftermath of colonial relationships, our colonial present. Again, a direct Gregory word for you, right? It's not before Europe, it's the aftermath of Europe. But of course, I keep saying Europe as we're not just talking about European colonizers, we're talking about all kinds of colonial relationships. So this is something you may be able to apply to other colonized relationships in different parts of the world as well, right? So those who are presented as backwards are actually products of very contemporary relationships, not just, colonial relationships that existed in the past, but very contemporary relationships. Okay, so thinking postcolonially allows us to study this. There's a specific method that I draw from Edward Said's writing. It's called Contrapuntal Reading, right? Basically put, it's about reading texts together, right? It's about reading texts together. So if you're interested in the migrant crisis, you do not just go to European studies of the migrant crisis. You look at different analyses of the migrant crisis, or the different dimensions and different analyses of the migrant crisis, and you look at them together so that you can analyze the relationships in between, right? It's all about studying the relationships in between. Some refer to this as connectedness. Some talk about connected histories approach. You may have actually come across this in your other classes, right? This is about discovering already existing relationships in the making of cultures that produce these kinds of crises, right? In the making of cultures and in allowing for the claim to know. Now, if you take that further step and try and read multiple texts together to be able to understand this portrayal of Mediterranean refugees, migrants as backward, as belonging to the past, as not respectful of women's rights. Of course, there's an element of truth in that, right? There's no denying that women's rights are not really in the place that women there would want to be in the 21st century, but there is a context to this as well. If you, and I'm here drawing from Moroccan sociologist Fatma Mernissi's work, right? And all her works are translated into English. Many of them are already in French. Some of them she wrote in French as well. So if you're interested in this, I turn to her works. And what she allows us to understand in terms of the making of the cultural making of this crisis is that, women's rights were not in the same situation in the 1930s, right? 1930s, just a little bit less than 100 years ago. Women's rights were in an upward trajectory at the time. The feminist movement was very strong in a number of Arab countries. In the 1950s, when the Arab League was being formed, feminist movement, especially the feminists in Egypt, played an important role in the writing of the Arab League Charter, right? That's another GSUM pointer for you, right? They were an important actor in the writing of the Arab League Charter. They allowed for the granting of women's right to vote in the 1940s, right to education, right to work, etc. So women's rights in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even when it come to the 1960s, were in an upward trajectory in many parts of this world. And it was not just an elite thing, right? Don't believe people who tell you that this was just an elite thing. It was not just an elite thing. It was actually trickling down to other parts of the society as well in a number of these countries that we're talking about, with the exception perhaps of Saudi Arabia and a number of Gulf countries. What happens is, and this is what Mernissi analyzes, is what she calls palace fundamentalism, this deal that is struck between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and its Western European and North American allies on the other hand, to stable the flow of oil, to regulate the flow of oil and stable the price of oil, right? To regulate the flow of oil and to stabilize the price of oil. North American, Western European actors allied with Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia that does not really respect any of these rights. There is no, the situation of the woman is not in the same place in that country. So Saudi Arabia is allowed to maintain its very conservative regime, right? But it is also allowed to encourage similarly minded non-state actors across the Arab world. Okay, it's allowed to encourage similarly minded actors across the Arab world. This is what she refers to as palace fundamentalism. So fundamentalism is not something that is just, a return to the past, right? Fundamentalism is something that is actually brought about, encouraged, fed, financed by a number of actors. And these actors include the very ancestors of those who were now worried about the cultural difference between migrants and European selves. Okay, so women's rights take a downward turn. Civil societal actors are suffocated. The more secular actors end up fleeing their countries, including academics, end up fleeing their countries. So the whole civil society starts to take a different shape, starting from the 1960s onwards, when this alliance between Saudi Arabia on the one hand, which is worried about its own regime security, and its allies in Western Europe and North America, which are worried about their own access to Saudi and Gulf oil, struck this alliance. It only gains strength after the 1973 oil embargo. Of course, Saudi Arabia, plays different roles in that oil embargo. And what we then see is the cultural production of culture, right? Cultural production of culture, the kind of culture that is considered as problematic, the kind of culture that European selves do not want to be included for fear of women's insecurity, and women's security is important. Of course, we should be in fear of that, right? Is not something that just happens just because some people have retrograde ideas about women, but these ideas have been produced on the one hand, and other ideas, the more secular, the more feminist ideas, have been suppressed on the other hand. If you go looking for it, all of this evidence is there, right? All of this evidence is there. It's only when you study all this evidence contrapuntally, when you read texts next to each other, and when you go to texts that you do not always read, that we actually start to grasp this bigger picture. When we go down the volcano, when we go to the cultural production of crises, and then we look at the production of culture itself, portrayals of culture and production of culture itself, to be able to get an entirely different sense of the insecurities involved. So a number of things I have explained very quickly, did not go into details. So I'm going to stop here. I won't talk more. I'm going to respond to your questions and your comments and, try and clarify certain things in the discussion. There is a lot of dialogue that is going on in the chat, and I haven't looked at it yet. So how would you like me to manage this?
Maybe I should read them or part of them just to make it easier for you.
I can. Oh, some of them are long. Okay.
But let me start by asking. I would like to ask a question. Because you started your presentation focusing on the idea of crisis and
yes.
building a crisis. And then you move from that into a broader discussion of the post-colonial perspective, and that I think would pertain to other forms of construction of threats, let's say, construction of views of security, or if some want to use the concept of securitization, that would also be an option. But I would like to ask you if the fact that in this case, and of course in others, there is this process of building a crisis, because not necessarily every threat can be portrayed as a crisis. You can have a threat that is not a crisis, right? So I wonder if you could address this difference, because I think of crisis as a situation in which there is a compression of time. So there is this need to make speedy decisions, this demand for speedy solutions, this very often a discourse that puts any possibility of reflection or even political debate aside. It's not possible because it is a crisis. Does this difference between a crisis and the building of threat more broadly, does it make a difference in terms of how we address these three different movements you talked about in terms of a post-colonial perspective?
Okay. No, thank you, Monica. I think securitization theory has one answer to your question. They would make the argument that a crisis or an emergency is a particular kind of securitization. It removes the issue from the realm of normal politics into security and then into a crisis, right? And as you pointed out, crisis is a particular kind of security problem. There's a pressure of time, decisions need to be made. So securitization already tries to remove politics from the discussion. The crisis or emergency is twice removed, or attempt to remove it twice from the political discussion. But as with securitization, it not being inevitable, it being a political move, this crisisification, some people talk about this in terms of literature, turning something into a crisis, crisisification of the Mediterranean refugee migrant flow. There are a number of articles about this. This is another step in terms of securitization and the labeling of issues. Whether there are relatively objective criteria to be considered when thinking about something as a crisis or not, and those who are talking about crises definitely claim so, right? We're not declaring this to be a crisis. There's no crisisification involved. Look at what is happening. We've also looked at what was happening. The numbers increased fourfold in the space of 3-month period. So there's clearly something unprecedented going on, right? And Greece was used to this, Italy was used to this, Spain was used to this, but not Denmark, not Germany, not the UK in this manner. So there's clearly something that is unprecedented going on. There are elements that allow for this, but the literature, as well as better than I do, that threat construction involves some seemingly objective elements, but there's always a politics involved in terms of deciding when to label something as a threat versus not. I think, contrary to the claims of those who are making use of crises for policy purposes, there is very little that actually that is objective, purely objective, that allows us to characterize something as a crisis. We're not. That's why I'm following Jutta Valdes's argument there in terms of the cultural production of crises. She makes the argument with reference to Cuban Missile Crisis. I've done a little bit of research on the Turkish-Syrian border, where Turkish little town in the Turkish border called Kilis was actually under missile attack coming from the Syrian side, probably coming from ISIS, but it was not named at the time. And this issue was not turned into a crisis. No one labeled as a crisis in Turkish politics. All kinds of emergency aid was sent, by the way, right? The issue was silently declared to be an emergency. It was silently addressed as a crisis, but not in terms of the headlines, not in terms of the politics that surrounded it. So, in terms of the material threat, people were were dying. There was a loss of life. Missiles were falling into Turkey, but the political, theater that actually surrounds crises or emergencies was not really there. It was more addressed via bureaucratic mechanisms and not in terms of the Speech Act, which is a very interesting example, actually, that goes against every kind of instinct, if you wish, that we have in the study of security. That's a very long-winded answer to your question. I don't know if I was able to. Okay, shall I attempt to read these questions?
Please do.
Yeah. Okay. So So after the questions are invited, I'll go in the order in which they're asked here. So thank you for mapping fundamental premises and questions that ensue. Keen to hear more about the archival and methodological discussions that you referenced regarding approaches to dealing with the colonial input. Some of our networks here are currently organizing the construction of counter-colonizing archives in Latin American and African contexts as a means to cultivate the political and epistemic conditions necessary to recenter the debate. Okay. Now, the best piece that I have read on the problem of archives in this is by Siba Grovogi, right? He discusses this, I think it's in the Power and Postcolonialism book by Gita Chowdhury and Sheila Nair, right? If one of you has access to the proper reference, please share it. Siba Grovogi has a chapter in this, but you can also find this in many of his writings, including his Beyond Eurocentrism book. He's done a lot of archival work, and he discusses what can and cannot be found in the archives and the politics involved in terms of writing about this, right? You can, if you're familiar with the discussions on Haiti in Brazil, so I don't need to remind you of Michel Trujillo's book. You can also look at that. And I have written a little piece in Security Dialogue in 2010, I think, on this problem of discovering or uncovering different kinds of sources if you're going to find out about non-Western discussions on security. So I gave you 3 sources about archival and methodological discussions. These discussions are ongoing, but these are 2 works that I find to be most valuable. There are more, of course. Okay, so someone seconds this. I can say more about this if you want. Just if you want to bring up something more specific. Writing my final thesis this semester, how can we think security beyond the human individual, post-human thoughts and indigenous cosmologies in Latin America on climate change? You're moving me into an area that I don't really know, right? This post-human perspectives, I would like to know more about that, but I don't really have any kind of insight into that. You may be interested in reading Anthony Burke's work. He's got, he's interested in this, and I think they have a recent edited book. He has a co-author there, so you may want to look at that. On cosmologies, I have recently co-edited a special issue of a Turkish journal in English, right? Rest assured, it's in English, called International Relations. So if you look it up online, it's International Relations in Turkish, right? David Blaney and I can't remember the co-author's name, but they have a piece on cosmologies and global IR. So that may actually be a good starting point, not necessarily focusing on the Latin American dimension, perhaps, but more the theoretical discussion. So I'm giving you recommendations on a part of the literature that I'm not entirely familiar with. So if I'm missing something, please share your references and thoughts in the chat, and we can have a discussion about that as well. Okay. Explain a little bit more about the specificity of postcolonial thinking. When I say postcolonial approaches enable us to see the production of cultural difference, it's post-structuralism as well, yes. I can also see these approaches are thinking about the production of cultural difference, especially in the case of the self and the other. Okay, this is a question that I like because I know the answer, right? So keep asking these kinds of questions. Yes, post-structuralism is also interested in the self and other relationship, right? Sankara and Krishna wrote quite a few years ago a critique of post-structuralist international relations. So you may want to start reading that. It came out in Alternatives, I think as early as the late 1990s, right? Sankara and Krishna, right? What I think is missing from post-colonial, from post-structuralist approaches, but what I can't find in post-structuralist approaches and what I am able to find in post-colonial approaches is taking into account not only the material dimension, right? The development of underdevelopment, the bit that we already knew, the development of underdevelopment is the material dimension. Self and other relations is the ideational or identity dimension, right? But this co-constitutive relationship between the two, not only thinking about ourselves and others in terms of this, how we constituted our own identities vis-a-vis other, right? But how we have actually shaped each other beyond the identity is something that post-structuralist IR has not really focused on, right? I'm not saying they haven't done a good job. It was not their focus, so far as I am familiar with post-structuralism, of course. Here you may want to look at, for instance, Viviane Jabri's critique of Michel Foucault, right? Viviane Jabri's, it came out, I think, in International Political Sociology, right? Her critique of Michel Foucault is that Foucault does not consider, when he is very, initially he is very complimentary of Iranian revolutionaries, then he gets disillusioned after the revolution, right? Viviane Jabri, I may not be doing justice to her argument, but my understanding of her argument is that Foucault, she says, does not really think of Iran's role in the modern international. He looks at the Iranian revolutionaries initially as a source of hope. They're resisting this modern that is so encompassing, right? Creating all kinds of problems that Foucault has identified thus far. So he reads revolutionaries as a critique of modernity. Then he gets disillusioned with them. Jabri's critique, part of her critique, there's more to her argument there, is that he does not really see Iran as a part of the modern international, right? In terms of historically, but also the movement itself as a part of the modern international. Here, modernity does not get a normative connotation, by the way. We're not using the modern in any normative sense in part of the making of modernity. This dimension, this making of each other, this relation, this connected histories. Remember, I talked about postcoloniality, thinking postcolonially, allowing us to study connections. This we don't really get beyond self and other relations in post-structuralism. This historical connections, ideational connections, material connections. But remember, material connections going beyond the discovery of fire or, the printing press, etc. Going beyond the obvious dimensions. John Hobson has done an excellent job in terms of identifying those material dimensions, but there is more in terms of the ideational give and take, in terms of the making of all these all these things that we call modernity. Walter Mignolo, of course, talks about this, but if you're familiar with his work, he has a different kind of suggestion in terms of how to get out of this. Okay. You missed the name of the last researcher that I mentioned, right? What exactly did you miss? It's difficult for me to know. Anyone can help us? So in what context I was referring to this? The Moroccan one. Okay, very good. Fatima Mernissi.
Can you write it down in the chat, Pinar? Could you write it down in the chat?
I can do that. Moroccan sociologist, wrote in French, everything translated into English. She's wonderful. Passed away a number of years ago now. Okay, Paula's question. Ended my reflections touching upon the international politics of women's insecurity in the immigration crisis, whether I can expand on this gender dimension beyond this particular case and share my thoughts on what it entails in our efforts of thinking post-colonially about security. Okay, we're going beyond what I know now. This is a difficult one. Conflict resolution is Monica's thing, so I'm going to ask for your help here. But this gender dimension beyond this particular case, I haven't actually done my homework on this one, gender dimension beyond this particular case. But I have read others who have done their homework. Okay, I'll write it down. As Monica reminded me, this is a better way of doing this. Uma Narayan's work I find to be very helpful here. Vivienne Jabri has a co-edited book from the early 2000s where she deals with many of these questions of the production of culture, right? So she's one of the early scholars who brought the post-colonial dimension into critical IR already. So there is the gender dimension in that as well. And of course, another one of my interest areas, not research, but interest areas, militarism and the production and reproduction of some cultures as naturally militarist, right? And the production of reproduction of this through gendered ideas is another dimension that I have been interested. My thoughts on what it entails in our efforts to think post-colonially. Here, there is a dimension that post-colonial thinking about gender covers, and I haven't really seen it covered in other approaches. This is thinking about international politics of gender, right? Not women, but international relations as gendered relations. Now, Spike Peterson, of course, has this book from the 1990s, Gendered States, right? But this discussion goes beyond, I think, what Peterson and her colleagues at the time were exploring. This analyzing the hierarchical gendered dimension of international politics is something that post-colonial authors have introduced us to. And here I'd like to mention the work of my late colleague, Lily Link, right? She passed away too soon, a number of years ago, but you can look at her book, Post-Colonial International Relations from early 2000s, where she brings constructivism to talk to postcolonialism, right? And looks at Asians' relationship with the West. There we see a gendered analysis of international politics, going beyond women, right? Going beyond women's problems, women's insecurities, which are all important, but how our hierarchies in world politics are gendered, and how some states are giving gendered responses to international politics, and the implications of this actually for women at home and for minorities at home, that may actually bring in the kind of conflict resolution dimension that you were looking for. I don't know whether there is research on this. There's likely to be, but I'm not really familiar. So another long-winded answer. Just Mani's talk. I didn't know this. Right? Is this available in English, Paolo? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll make a note of this. So. Okay. Okay. Again, Paulo's question, highlighting the indispensability of looking at the imprint of colonialism for both colonized and colonizers. Following up my answer to view of the culturalist penchant of some postcolonial approaches, could I expand on the relation between the dimension of knowing culture and that of material exploitation, specifically the double dimension of imprinting both colonizer and colonized? I'm not sure if I understand the question very well. Do you want to elaborate? Help me here, Paulo? You can't turn your audio on, no? Ah, different setup. I made a mistake when writing Lily's name.
Okay, now I can speak.
Okay.
Thank you. I've been cleared. It was just if you could elaborate more on the relationship between the aspect of knowing and claims to knowledge and the aspect of material exploitations, because in your answer to Caroline, you said that one key import of post-colonial perspectives over post-structuralist one is specifically the attention to the material dimension and the development and underdevelopment. So how these two dimensions kind of relate in, or how you think about the relations of these two things.
Okay, I see now. Okay, thank you for the clarification. Right. Let's take a couple of steps back. If you're reading only about, say, economic development in Latin America, if you're only reading about this in textbooks that were written entirely in line with modernization theory approach, there is a claim to know there, isn't it? There's a claim to know what modern economy is and how to go about creating a modern economy. There's a claim to know there, right? Now, if that claim to know goes unchallenged, if there is no critique involving the development of underdevelopment, right? And that there was a lot of work that went into getting that critique recognized. If that challenge goes on, if that claim to know goes unchallenged, right? We don't get to understand how that material exploitation goes beyond the colonial relationship and is very much a part of our present. Okay, so it's important that claim to know what modernity is, what a modern economy entails, and how to produce successful modern economies. That claim to know that you find in certain textbooks needs to be challenged. If that claim to know is not interrogated, right? If it goes unchallenged as the knowledge about economy, modernity, state, society, then we don't get to hear about this material exploitation. The best you'll hear about it in your history textbooks as something that happened in the past. So don't keep going on about it, right? You don't get to hear about the present dimension. And you definitely don't get to hear about the dimension that links our, say, remember, coffee consumption to making a crisis and, genocidal conflict possible in another part of the world. That claim to know needs to be challenged. That claim to know, of course, is challenged by critical approaches to international relations, right? Definitely, that goes, the critical international relations is an important part of challenging this. They have actually, studied the politics of knowledge, critical IR scholars, and pointed to the sociology of knowledge as well as critical politics of knowledge. But there are different dimensions to that politics that postcolonialism allows us to understand and the relationships to disentangle. Here, an important work, and you can actually find the important pointers in Sankaran Krishna's work. Again, I think he's very helpful in terms of looking at this. And Himadip Upidi also has a book on I can't remember the name of the global, I think, and where he talks about globalization from this critical perspective. So these are, so this is Krishna. Yeah, and Mupidi. If you're into nuclear weapons, we can have more references here as well. Very interesting. So on nuclear weapons, this is the author that I frequently consult. Okay, did I cover everything? Any objections?
Okay. Do we have any additional questions, comments? Okay, Pinar, I have to thank you very much for this extremely interesting presentation and discussion. The advantages of using Zoom to be able to have you here today. And thank everybody for attending. This was an event of GSOM. It's part of our project called Print that brought Pinar actually here earlier. And we're also thankful for the state agency, CAPES, that is actually financing the project. Thank you all. Have a nice day and a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
I'd also like to say thank you again for the organization and everyone for staying with us for an hour and a half and for the questions. If you have further questions, if you missed some of the references, please feel free to email me. I'm easy to find on the internet. Feel free to email me and I'll try and be helpful. Okay.